I'd like to welcome you to the Tuesday Times Roundtable. My name is Stephanie Dosher, and I'm the Associate Director of the Office of Global Learning Initiatives. And we're proud to co-sponsor the Tuesday Times Roundtable series, both at this campus and at BBC campus, with student government and the New York Times readership program and all of the departments and colleges and schools at the university that sponsor the New York Times readership program. So today, on the 11th anniversary of 9/11, I'm particularly gratified that we're going to spend an hour of our day seriously considering the health of our planet and of all the creatures, both living, animal, vegetable, and mineral, maybe we should put it that way, that inhabit this planet. And we'll also have a chance to think about the things that we can do personally to increase the health of the planet that we all call home. So to get us started, I would like to introduce our discussion leader today, Professor Jean Rosenberg. Dr. Rosenberg is a marine biologist in the Department of Biological Sciences. His interests are in ecology, biodiversity, and biogeography of the red, green, and brown seaweeds of Florida and the Caribbean. And when I read that, I just couldn't help but think about sushi samba. They have an amazing seaweed dish. Seaweed dish there, red, brown, and green. It's my favorite thing to get there.
But what do you think they wrap the sushi in? What flavor of seaweed? Red, brown, or green? Red, brown, or green?
Isn't it green?
Looks green.
It looks green, but it's not?
Does anybody know?
What color is it?
Well, it looks green, but it's red. It's a red alga, actually.
It's red?
Yeah, it's a red alga. Porphyra. No,
sushi class in marine biology. Prior to arriving at FIU, Dr. Rosenberg was in the botany department of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. His interest in marine plants began when he was an undergraduate at Stanford University and continued through his doctoral research at Yale. Dr. Rosenberg also studied abroad at the Monterrey Institute of Technology, Mexico, the University of Paris, Sorbonne, and the Complutense
University
of Madrid, Spain. Since finishing graduate school, he has worked at the University of Barcelona, Spain, the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, the Institute of Oceanology, I won't say oceanography, but oceanology in Havana, Cuba, and Laval University in Quebec, as well as other universities in the US and Canada. He has participated in oceanographic cruises ranging from the Greenland Sea to the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the Caribbean. He also studied microbial communities under the Arctic sea ice in Hudson Bay. As part of his global focus, Dr. Rosenberg became a member of societies in the study of algae in the US, Mexico, and Brazil. Human impact on the global ocean are the focus of today's discussion, an acid test for marine life. Take it away, Professor Rosenberg.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today. And despite the fact that we live here in Miami, I think it's a real advantage if you're a marine biologist, let me tell you. Because for example, when I was teaching at Laval University, I was teaching marine biology, I showed students slides of things like coral reefs, seagrass beds, and mangroves. And they all have to take it on faith because they had absolutely no personal experience in life of these kinds of habitats. So we're very privileged to live here in South Florida. And in fact, I'm just wondering how many of you are scuba divers? If you could raise your hands. No. Well, okay. How about how many of you have gone, say, snorkeling on a coral reef? Okay. Most students. That's what I thought, in teaching classes here at Miami, that's a big advantage that I start with because at least you, as FIU students, most of you from South Florida, have some familiarity with the habitat. So it makes it much easier to develop a kind of a global understanding. Well, let's start this is this title slide sort of is thematic in a way of the problem we're going to be dealing with, and it's just are we heading from that to that? It's the question today. All right, so let me see. All right, so let's start actually with the New York Times article. I think it's a nice article, and in fact, the New York Times is, in my opinion, I use it a lot in my classes, and I think they have the best science writing of any of the major newspapers. And a really good science article is just like, it's like poetry, you know. And the person who produces that science article typically has a background in science as well as journalism, say an undergraduate degree in some science, like biology, and then a journalism degree too. And that's a real powerful combination for just absolutely top-notch science journalism. Okay, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask someone in the audience the title of the article is Life in the Sea Found Its Fate in a Paroxysm of Extinction. That's a wonderful word, paroxysm, And someone with a college education, right? But in any case, if someone could please, for the group, summarize the article for us, first of all. Okay, and volunteer to summarize the article. Don't be shy. Come on. Someone. Yes, please, thank you.
The article is basically about how increases in carbon dioxide cause terrible effects in the environment, especially in the ocean, and how we as humans are also causing
That's right. That's certainly an important conclusion of the article. And so, but what do you already know? What does the article sort of do to fill you in on the background for that sort of bottom line, which you outlined for us very well? What's the starting point? Extinction. What extinction? Of the marine species. When? Yeah, a long, long time ago, as the story goes, right? In fact, about over 250 million years ago, at the border between the Permian and the Triassic periods. And not only was it, it's considered to be sufficiently cataclysmic that it's not only the border between two periods in geological history, it's even between two eras, between the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic as well. So that's a big deal in geological history. Okay. What did they, in terms of the magnitude of these extinctions, I'm just going to give you a few figures that were not in the article. For example, of the corals that existed at the time, 96% of the genera of corals gone. And in fact, that includes two important kinds of corals, the tabulate and the rugose corals, that were gone forever as a result of the Permian extinction. Bivalves, clams, and things like that, did pretty well. They only were 59% of the genera went extinct. Snails, about 98% of the genera, but they made a nice comeback. Overall, do you remember what the article said in terms of the overall number of species that went extinct? 95%, yeah. That's right. Okay. What were the, back in the Permian, if you put it in your time machine, what are the conditions you would have found in the ocean that were associated with the extinction? That's, I think, one of the things that's important in the article as we, go from the geological, paleontological record to the modern times. So what sort of conditions were prevailing that were associated with this extinction? Yes?
Distribution of carbon
That's right. They talk about the journalist Alana Mitchell refers to carbon gases. So what are these gases? Methane is one, yeah. Carbon dioxide. Methane is CH4. Let me see here. Okay, so methane is CH4, and carbon dioxide is CO2. We'll refer to CO2 a lot. Okay. What other conditions were what other conditions can we deduce from the paleontological record? Well, yeah, that's one theory, but what are the environmental conditions that were for the cause? But what are the environmental conditions that were? Yeah, that's right, ocean acidity, ocean acidification. What other conditions?
Ocean warming and oxygen poor form.
Yes, that's right. Oxygen, a decrease in the amount of oxygen, and warming as well. Ocean warming and also atmospheric warming, too, because the two are connected. Okay, it's amazing, these are called, we can't go back and measure these things directly, put a thermometer in the ocean, take a pH meter and put it in a Permian ocean. We can deduce these things from evidence in the fossil record, in the geological record, as well as fossils and isotopes as well. In fact, it's referred to as the Great Dying. And this is what we hope to forestall happening today. Okay. Because there are probably, what are the organisms that are, if you look at the Permian extinction, what were the kinds of organisms in the ocean that were most affected? The article does mention it. Check in there. What were the kinds of organisms? Not necessarily the group, but what did these organisms do in common? Yeah, that's right. They deposit calcium carbonate in corals as an example. They have a calcium carbonate skeleton, right? And there are other organisms that make, like clams and things, that make calcium carbonate shells. So let's take a little look, just to familiarize you with some of the kinds of organisms that do that thing, the calcifying thing. And so these are some animals that deposit calcium carbonate, which is CaCO3, in their shells or skeletons. And they range from single-celled guys, like this foram, so it's actually a single cell, and up to much larger organisms like this coral. This is a massive coral, and here are branching corals here. Here's a sea urchin, Strongylus introtus. Barnacles, they're in the arthropods actually, so they're the clam. The snails, these are a bunch of snails that are huddling in a moist area on the rocks in the intertidal zone. We don't have too many of the rocks in the intertidal zone here in Miami, but there are other places in the country like New England that have a lot of rocks on the rocky coastline. And here's one that you're probably less familiar with, but it's very important out there in the open ocean. It's a pteropod mollusk. It looks sort of like a marine butterfly of some sort, but they also produce they also deposit calcium carbonate as well. And now, so we take a look at some animals. Let's look at some plants. What is the plant thing? What are the plant things? What do the plants do that's so special, makes them plants? Photosynthesis, right? They fix carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into organic compounds. All right, and like the animals, they cover the whole gamut in the range of size. Starting with the microscopic, this is something called a coccolithophorid, which is a single-celled alga. And these are this individual cell, and the holes in the back are actually just the filter that it's photographed on. And the individual plates that just cover this cell are made out of you-know-what, calcium carbonate, and they're called coccoliths. Here's something that, if you're diving, it looks like a big boulder. In fact, you might, if you just did if a first glance, it might look sort of like, say, oh, that's a coral. No, it's not. It's actually a plant. It's a red alga, a crustose coral, very appropriately, a crustose coralline red alga. Sometimes these are called live rock, when you put in if you put in your marine aquarium. Yeah.
I can't help but ask a question about the coccolithophorid and the structure of that cell.
Coccolith?
Yeah. What's the purpose of the way that it's structured? Like, how do those little aspects, those circular wheel-like aspects, how do they act or behave? Or
Well, the answer to your question is, I don't know.
yeah.
I'll
It's
tell
just
you,
amazing that it looks
they
like
do
that.
help. They're used to identify the species.
Yeah.
Okay, because these things have these very intricate sculpturing on them. So, yeah. And then here's another calcifying plant, which you probably have seen. It's very abundant if you were, just snorkeling around on coral reefs right around here in South Florida. And this is the green alga. This is Halimeda, actually. Okay. Ocean acidification it's referred to as, you'll see it referred to often as the other CO2, the other CO2 problem. So what's the implied first CO2 problem, that this is the other CO2 problem? Two. Global warming. Yes, exactly. Or climate change, global warming and climate change. And well, we know we know from the article that we just read in the New York Times that what's causing this is because CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere. What's the cause for that? Us, that's right. All the different things. Cars is one thing. What in general, cars use gasoline, but what in general is the cause of what? Energy, our energy needs, which depend a lot on burning coal, petroleum, fossil fuels. That's right. Now, we can actually, go out there this afternoon on the dock and thank your local ocean, because we can just thank our local ocean, because if it weren't for them, because of all the CO2 put in the atmosphere by human activities, things would be a lot hotter than they are. In fact, only about 45% of the carbon that we emit, that we add to the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, stays in the atmosphere. So about 45% remains in atmosphere. Only. And where does the rest of the CO2 go? Well, the rest of the CO2 is taken up, two things mainly, by the oceans and also by the terrestrial plants that are on land, that have an important role as well. So the oceans, in fact, absorb more than a third, maybe a third to a half, of the CO2. And this is where I'm referring to, of the CO2 that's produced by these human activities, by burning fossil fuels. Yeah.
Is it true that now these animals that use the CO2 for their shells, like such as crabs and the butterfly that you mentioned, now that there's too much CO2, what's happening to them? They're consuming too much, so they're...
Well, you might think that it would favor, we'll take a look at that in a moment. You might think, you're right, you might think that there's more CO2 around that can be used to put into shells and skeletons and things, but there's a little wrinkle to the situation that makes it work sort of the other way. Well, how much CO2, you read these things, whenever you read ecosystem science, you're confronted with really big numbers, giga this and all that sort of stuff. Well, how much CO2 is produced by human activities? About 22 million tons of of this figure of what goes into the oceans absorb more than a third of the CO2 that's produced by human activities. How much is that the oceans absorb? About 22 million tons of CO2 per day. You can get bigger numbers, if you use per year and all that stuff. So, but that's plenty. This is what goes to the ocean. As I mentioned, this is actually in many ways a good thing because it keeps things from it keeps the warming from being even greater, which would happen if the oceans didn't take up all that CO2. But it has another negative consequence, which is, as we've seen, ocean acidification. That's sort of unfortunately goes along with it. How does that happen? Well, when CO2 is in the atmosphere, it's CO2 gas, and then so it passes from the atmosphere into the water, and in the water it produces a weak acid that's called carbonic acid. So, and the reaction would be this. So carbon dioxide in the water combines with the water and forms, it's a chemical equilibrium, H2CO3. This is that weak acid. It's called carbonic acid. Mm-hmm. And the carbonic acid itself then dissolves in the water, and it releases hydrogen ions and another ion called bicarbonate. So here's the carbonic acid, and it reacts to release hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. And it's this increase in the hydrogen ion concentration in the water that is what we refer to when we're talking about acidity. Okay? So that's key, the concentration of the hydrogen ions. The problem with that is that the increased acidity makes the calcium carbonate in the shells and the skeletons of the organisms that we looked at on the slides dissolve more easily. So that's the problem. It's causing a problem. It's not just producing more inorganic carbon in the water to produce these shells and skeletons and so forth. And so they're made out of, the shells and skeletons are made out of calcium carbonate, remember? And the acid acts on them to dissolve them. So it releases calcium ions into the water.
Question up here.
Yeah.
Did you want to make a
Yeah. Would the increasing acidity forcing the calcium carbonate to become more bicarb and calcium ions have to do with like adjusting the ocean's buffer capacity?
Yes, yeah, that's right. The ocean is actually pretty buffered. So what it means is what this means in practice, it's a really good point. What this means in practice, you can put an awful lot of carbonic acid into the ocean, and the ocean has this capacity to absorb it. But we put in so much that we've actually reached a sort of a critical point. So yeah, that's true. So so what's happening here is you have dissolution occurring, and that is the opposite of the calcification, which is what's occurring when organisms produce these calcium carbonate shells and skeletons. So the net result is that the increase in the acidity can decrease the rate of calcification. Now, even if organisms can sort of, really keep up that rate of calcification, the rate of dissolution can still increase so that the organisms, when you have these conditions of high CO2, have to expend more energy in order to push that reaction to the left in the direction of calcification, so in the direction of skeleton and shell deposition. And the result of that is that the increased energy cost is that growth slows down or it stops completely. So acidity, you'll often hear referred to, and I'm not going to, this is the only technical part, I guess, is you'll hear it referred to on a scale as pH, and we talk about having a lower pH, and that means it's more acid. And pH is a way of expressing acidity. It's a logarithmic function of the concentration of hydrogen ions. Now, the ocean is not, from what I've said so far, you might begin to think like the ocean is acidic. It's not actually acidic per se. The ocean is actually slightly in the other direction. It's a slightly alkaline. And so the ocean has a pH of approximately 8.2. So it's sort of a general average. And pure water, what's the pH of pure water? Pure water is neutral. Does anyone know? 7, yeah. That's pH equals 7. That's the 7.0. That's the pH of pure water. All right. Well, remember that seltzer bottle we had on the first slide? So what would be the pH of seltzer water, for example? Seltzer water is water that has had a lot of CO2 pumped into it. So makes it fizzy. That's the same, actually, if you're having a soda right now for lunch, that's the same idea, but there are other things in soda as well. But what would be the pH of seltzer water? It's about pH 4.0, so it's very clearly on the acid side there. And your Coca-Cola is actually even more acid than that, if you're curious. Now the increase, how much has been the increase in pH because of all of this CO2 that's entering the ocean? I'm talking about, at a global scale. Well, all this CO2 from fossil fuel has lowered the pH by 0.1 pH units. I don't hear from you out there a gasp of awe, right? So the pH now is about 8.1, okay, compared to 8.2. Oh my goodness. Well, yeah. I'll tell you why that makes a difference. Oh, this would be since, good, thank you. Yeah, that would be since we started pumping all that CO2 into the atmosphere, so since the beginning of the industrial era. And in fact, if we keep up business as usual, we're going to drop it even more. It's going to drop from here, it's going to drop another 0.4 pH units by the end of the century. Okay? And that's just if the CO2 emissions continue to grow with the current sort of business as usual scenario. Now, I know this doesn't sound like much, but remember that the pH scale is logarithmic. So a drop in the pH of 1 unit represents what multiple of increase in acidity? Anybody? 10, that's right. That's a drop of 1 unit represents a 10-fold increase in acidity. And a drop, so what does that mean here? A drop of 0.4 units by the end of the century means we're going to increase the acidity by about 2.5 times relative to when we first started, at the beginning of the industrial era. The drop of pH since that time of 0.1 unit that's already occurred means that we've increased the acidity of the ocean by 30% already, by about a third.
Do we have an idea of what the acidity dropped to during the Great Dying?
We do actually. Well, we sort of have a lot of indirect evidence, right? And so that's that's actually highlighted in the New York Times article. I can't give you the exact number though.
Yeah.
This just shows, in the time we've actually been making measurements of CO2 in the atmosphere, the changes that take place. And this is measured in Hawaii, out in the middle of the Pacific. And this is at Mauna Loa is the station on the main island of Hawaii where the CO2 is measured, and this is the station where the pH is measured. And this is the year on the bottom. And up right now, the current concentration in the atmosphere is about, it's measured as about 390 parts per million. This is parts per million by volume of CO2. And we're heading up quickly, as you can see. Dr. Kopters has a number of students here from the plant ecology class, and one of you can tell me why this is so spiky. This is the CO2 concentration, so it's in the atmosphere, so it's this side. Why is it so spiky? This is called the Keeling curve, after the scientist who first published it. Anybody? Yes? I know Dr. Kopter knows, so I don't. Yes?
I'm going to take a guess because of the seasons.
Yeah, well, that's right. It's seasonal. Most of the land mass is in the northern hemisphere, and there's a lot of well, what do you have growing on land? Hopefully, trees. A lot of plants. So this represents the seasonal drawdown of the CO2 in the atmosphere in the spring, okay, every year, and then the organic matter falls to the ground, decomposes, and the bacteria break down the organic carbon back into CO2, and so it spikes up again. So you can see these annual spikes. Okay, back to the main story here. The concentration. This one here is the concentration. This is in the air, and this is the concentration in seawater. And you can see since it's been measured, it's been increasing from about 8.2 to about 8.3 in this case. And then this, the green one, is the pH of that seawater, and you can see it's been going down. It's gone from over 8.1 to just a little over 8. Okay. Okay, that's over a period of, if you look at this is since 1960, okay? Let's expand our perspective a little bit. We can do that. We can ask how much CO2 was there in the atmosphere over time, over a longer time span, going back, say, 1,000 years. And you can do that because in the ice, they take ice cores in the Arctic that are very long, that go back a long way, and they're little microscopic bubbles that are trapped in there, and you can measure the CO2 in the bubbles. And so this shows, going back for a bunch of ice, this is a lot of different ice cores, going back to the year 1000. And you can see it just spikes up rapidly here. So this is what it looks like. The other, when you just look at it since 1960, it just looks like a gradual rise. And then when you expand it, boom, it just spikes up like that. This is a very famous graph. This graph was first published in 2001 in there's something called the Intergovernment Panel for Climate Change. They're an intergovernment body that is analyzing the problem, and they produce a comprehensive series of reports. The next one is coming out in, I think, 2014. And at any rate, this is called the hockey stick graph. And the line in the middle is just the relative to the 1961 to 1990 average. So below that, it's below that average, and then above that, it's above that average. And the blue represents the data that comes from paleontological proxies, so we're estimating using various means that we have available to us, again, going back to the year 1000. And you can see actually it's a little bit, it starts out being kind of warm. And this is actually called the medieval warm period. So that's reflected in the graph. And then you can see it starting here, it just, in the 19th century, it just really starts to spike up. And this was really attacked a lot, and there was a lot of discussion about it. We can talk about that too. But the overall, so despite that, I think it's held up pretty well. The overall features of it certainly have held up. Okay, let's take a look at the ocean pH, which is really, what we're focusing on. This is the really long view. Yeah.
On that previous graph, was that gray shade significant?
Yeah, this is representing variability. It's that's right. And this is the really long view going back 25 million years before the present. And these dates are in the present. These are, of course, we weren't around with a pH meter to go and measure pH. But you can see that when we look at it on this scale, here's what's happening. You know, you've heard a lot, read a lot in the paper about going off the fiscal cliff, the financial cliff the government is doing, and we're going off the pH cliff. Here are some effects of high CO2. At the top, here's our friends, the coccolithophores, right? Again, with their coccoliths. And these are cells that were grown at about 300 parts per million. We're way past that now. We're up at about 390. And this is in the bottom row here are the same. This is the same cells that are grown at the concentrations we can expect here at the end of on Earth at the end of this century. And so you can see, comparing these two sets of photographs here, that these guys on the bottom, they look kind of a bit peaked, right? I mean, the coccoliths are malformed. They're dissolved away, and in general, these do not look like happy campers on the bottom, growing under conditions of high CO2. And this is just an example. And finally, since we're very concerned with coral reefs, corals are important calcifying organisms, and they're important to us, those of us who live in South Florida. Here's a look into the future at what's going to happen, the suitability to the oceans around the world this goes back to 1765, and then 1994, we're closer to this now, 2040, and finally the end of this century. And the scale shows areas where you would get optimal coral growth, in other words, where there's a lot of saturation of calcium carbonate, and the purple indicates areas where it's dissolution that's going to predominate. And so these are not suitable environments for corals to grow in. And so you can see that this is the situation, let's call it situation today, even though we're somewhat past this. And you can see there's still a lot of red, but it's gone down a lot from what it was at the beginning, in the pre-industrial era. And when you're looking ahead, it doesn't look too good. It looks like that the environments that are presently favorable, the coral reefs, are not going to be so favorable. And corals are especially vulnerable because they deposit a form of calcium carbonate that's called aragonite. And aragonite dissolves easier than the more stable form of calcium carbonate, which is also, you find it's more abundant in the world, which is called calcite. So on the other hand, corals are not just sitting there; they're exposed to the ocean. They're covered by a thin layer of tissues. So the skeleton is not in direct contact with seawater, and the place where corals deposit their skeleton is actually in an internal compartment inside the coral. And inside that compartment, when the acidity increases, the corals, they're able to maintain the conditions that are needed for calcification, but again, there's a cost. They're expending more energy to maintain the chemical balance in that internal compartment so they can deposit calcium carbonate, and consequently, the growth slows down or just comes to a halt. And in addition, all we're doing right now is we're just considering acidification is the only problem that corals face. What are some other problems that corals face? I know. This is yes, you can mention Elizabeth. Coral diseases is certainly one, and some others. That's right. Global warming is a biggie. Some others. Pollution. Okay. When humans mess around on land and they have agriculture, you get a lot of runoffs, you get sedimentation, which can smother the corals. And even there are some things that have indirect effects on corals like you wouldn't imagine, but they do, like overfishing. So, ocean acidification is on top of all that. And the effect on marine ecosystems is going to be multiplied because corals are they're the basic structural component of the coral reefs, and so thousands of other species depend on them. you'll notice in this series of graphs that colder waters at high latitudes, well, they're less propitious for calcium carbonate deposition because they hold more carbon dioxide than warmer waters, and they're undersaturated with respect to calcium carbonate, so it's more difficult for calcification to occur. And that's also true in deep waters too, cold deep waters as well. And so you can imagine that the effect of increased CO2 will be even worse for organisms that are calcifying organisms that live in deep waters. And you can just imagine that a lot of those organisms that make shells and skeletons that live in those kinds of environments will end up being outcompeted by other kinds of organisms that, well, you may find you don't like as much, right? They're less desirable. So, what I'd like to do is I'd like to consider some questions. We talked about some threats to coral reefs, so let's elaborate a little bit, and we can rank them from global threats. These guys are difficult to deal with. Ocean, world ocean acidification, world, global climate change, global warming, that sort of thing. And then there are things that are much more local, and because they're local, they're more under our control. So let's consider what are some major threats to coral reefs, to the marine environment, to coral reefs in particular, say. That we mentioned some, so let's put them down and rate them as to whether they'd be global or they'd be local. What do you think? Talked about climate change. Is that global? Yeah, that's really global. Climate change. And the topic of today's talk was acidification, global or local? Global or local in that? What do you think?
You can't contain the ocean.
Yeah, so it's...
So it mixes everywhere.
Yeah, it mixes everywhere, right. And it's related to this, the same thing that's related to what's causing the climate change. So all that CO2. So ocean acidification would certainly be up there in the global end of things.
Does it vary, ocean acidification in different parts of the ocean? Because I noticed in that map you had like corals were going to be in trouble.
Well, corals, yeah, yes, that's right. This refers specifically to corals, actually, but I mean, it also refers to conditions for calcification in general.
But the ocean is uniform pH.
No, there is variability. It's not uniform, really. I shouldn't. It's, for example, the average of today is about 8.2 is the pH, but that's they would fall within a range about 8.1 to 8.3, I would say, would be a natural range. But that's true. It gives the false impression that it's exactly the same everywhere. It depends on mixing, on the thermal, the deep water circulation and exchanges with the surface, that sort of thing.
In that sense, then, it's global because everybody has to deal with the issue, but it can be more local or regional in the sense that the effects are different.
Well, yes, that's true. That's right. It can have different effects depending on where you live, the kinds of ecosystems there, that sort of thing. The extent that the people who live there depend on the local marine resources for their livelihoods and so forth. How about some other things? I heard someone mention. Elizabeth mentioned Elizabeth Lacey, who's a colleague in the Department of Biology, mentioned coral diseases, and that's sort of global or really local. Yeah, it's sort of more. It's tending more to local. I mean, these coral, they can be carried around. So let's throw them in here somewhere in between. Coral diseases, invasive species. Where would invasive species be? Yeah, well, for particular species, they don't get distributed over the whole planet. So somewhere in the middle. Okay, some other problems in the marine environment we talked about too. What was one? Another one. Pollution. Ah, okay. How about that? Where would you put that? Sort of local or more global?
I would say,
For a particular source of pollution. We're talking about particular sources of pollution.
I would say local.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the, in fact, that's something we can get a handle on if we decide to do it. Okay.
Are there so other human impacts like, damage from boating and
Good.
looting,
Yeah.
people that steal the coral for whatever?
Direct physical damage. That's right. That's something that that's something that we really have a lot of control over as individuals. Direct physical damage. We don't want to we don't want to run our boats and ground them into coral reefs and things like that. We don't want to mine our local coral reefs to to get limestone blocks for building, for example. You can see a lot of buildings in Miami that are made out of limestone that come from the coral reefs. You can still see the corals and identify them to species, by the way.
I got a question.
Yeah.
Where can we put the increasing of natural disturbance like hurricanes or tropical storms, since the cause is kind of global level, but
Yeah,
the impact is pretty
Yeah,
much
right.
local?
That's true. That's true. And that, I mean, that is tied up with climate change. So it responds to global drivers. But you're right. The effects are regional as well. Okay. Yeah. How about we mentioned another one is overfishing. Where would that be? And this is not absolute. Everything is approximate. I mean, the ends are pretty clear, but what's in the middle is,
Well,
where.
since Coral River pretty much close by the shoreline, I would say it's local.
Yeah, that's right, because that's something else we can pretty much control. So overfishing, if we want to. And some other things that here in Miami we live in a place where there's a lot of sort of what, economic activity, coastal development, right? Can we control that? Yeah, we can do something about that. So. Oh, and there's an important one that we've forgotten, actually. And it hasn't been the topic. No one has brought it up. It hasn't come into our discussion so far. But we put stuff into the water, other than pollution per se, that has an effect on the marine, a serious effect on the marine environment. And what would that be? Nutrients. Yeah, that's right. For example, agriculture. Most of the fertilizer we put on on agricultural land ends up in the bodies of water and the rivers and ends up in the ocean and estuaries and things like that. So this is nutrient overloading. So that would be something that's something certainly we can do something about.
What about, I don't know, this might kind of fit in something that's already there, like the direct physical damage, but oil drilling and now the new idea of wind farms out, in the ocean, the effects.
Oil drilling, yeah, that would be pollution,
Those
right?
things,
Yeah. Wind farms.
And maybe physical damage too, I don't know.
Wind farms, yeah, I suppose there might be physical damage in installing wind farms, but
Wave farms that capture the water current.
Right.
yeah, that's true. There are these alternative energy schemes. We also mentioned along the way sedimentation, because when you change land use, you can get a big slug of sediments that enter the water, and that can smother coral reefs. And that's something, that's related to land use. It's something we can sort of control. So nutrient overloading we mentioned, and that would be somewhere down here too, and sedimentation. So, it's encouraging to know that there are some things that we can do something about, I think, right? And the sum can be, and the sum can be the sum of the parts. And then there are other things that are really difficult to get a grasp on. We're nowhere, what was what was it called, the Kyoto Agreement? What was that? Does anyone know about that? The Kyoto Agreement? Carbon emissions, yeah, and they set targets, right? That they were. What were the and what were, does anyone remember what the targets were?
We didn't sign off.
Yeah.
We didn't sign off. Yeah, that's right. We didn't sign off. What were the targets? Actually, were to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions by this year, by 2012, to the 1990 levels. How are we doing? Well, not very well. Okay, so the problem is we always have this argument. Well, can the U.S. economy afford a smaller carbon footprint? Can we afford to, with an 8.5% unemployment rate, et cetera, you hear some politicians say that controlling carbon dioxide emissions is job killing. What do you think about that? Should it be a less high priority now than, or should it still be a high priority for us? Yeah.
Still be a high priority because in the future you're still gonna have to waste money implementing the technology or whatever you want to do in the future. So if you do it now, you'll eliminate that consequence.
There was another comment too here.
I was pretty much going to say what he said, with the added, benefit of if we don't fix the problem now, there's no guarantee that we will be able to fix the problem in the future. So even if we just throw money at it and we had infinite funds, it's right now it's hard enough. We keep letting it go, it becomes even more expensive, and somebody's going to be left holding back. At the end of the day, somebody's going to be left with it, and I think there's a lot of attitude of, technology will take care of it, and, basically, grandkids and the kids, it'll be their problem, not ours, and not taking responsibility for it at all when it's still at lower levels, like he was saying, instead of, it just doesn't seem to be a priority because of the cost now, but the cost in the long run, it's not, at least from what I've read, I don't really think that it's even really good business to ignore it in the long term, because if you don't have resources because you haven't done anything to fix the problems, you have less access to those resources, then that reduces your amount of ability to make money in the future. So you spend a little now so that you can continue to make money in the future.
I mean, there's been talk of geoengineering, where we adapt to the change by doing things to counter, say, global warming, at the level of the whole planet. Some people advocate that. Fewer scientists than politicians, but is that a possibility, or no? Skeptical? Anybody think we could do that? For so when I'm talking about human case, there's also sort of an overshoot. I mean, the ozone hole. It was worked out what was causing the ozone hole over the Antarctic and over the polar areas, especially over the Antarctic, and we stopped doing what we were doing to cause that. We stopped producing these CFCs. Has the size of have we eliminated the ozone hole over the Arctic? Has anybody that's letting in UV radiation? Have we eliminated it because we're no longer producing CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons? Well, there's a statistical sort of, it shrinks and then it gets larger and it shrinks. It hasn't really, we don't use CFCs anymore, but the problem is there's a.
We don't in the US, but they do internationally.
Well, a lot.
And wasn't there a case reported in the New York Times?
Really?
About CFC, wasn't it CFC?
I thought we've curbed it mostly, but there's a.
There's an illegal trade coming through Miami.
Yes.
Of
There is.
CFCs. It was-
Really?
it was
Oh, that's
reported
interesting. I
in
didn't know.
the paper this week. Yeah, maybe the Herald even.
Huh.
And it's thriving in Miami. It's coming in from the Netherlands. I mean, they traced it. It was extraordinary.
There's also a big lag, and before it has its effect. And you'd have the same thing with ocean acidification or with global warming if we stopped today putting all that CO2 into the atmosphere. And how about organisms? We talked about humans. How about marine organisms? Can they evolve to tolerate, say, increased acidity? Just evolve? Is that a possibility? Yeah, we remember that. Remember the graph that shows, falling off the pH cliff. That's the changes are taking place pretty fast. In some cases it might be possible, in others no, and most likely it'll favor organisms that are more tolerant. And so, there are all sorts of. We have a professor, Dr. Feely in our department, Ken Feely in our department, who is concerned with, where he works. Not in the marine environment, but in the terrestrial environment. He's concerned about, and where in response to climate change, plants are going to go, and what the world of the future is going to look like. What can plants do when it gets warmer? Right, they can go upslope, but can they move fast enough? They're not known for, plants aren't known for being really speedy. Can they move fast enough? Do we know? How about if people have gotten in the way since then too, So, if we hadn't developed areas or turned land, turned land that was into agricultural uses, that it might be possible, but now the escape route is cut off. And in fact, we can apply this to the marine environment too. So, this is from the comic strip BC. An unlikely scenario and unlikely to evolve in our lifetimes. So, were there any further, issues that are, comments that people wanted to make on what faces us in the future? As that famous marine biologist Vladimir Lenin wrote in book, "Что делать?" What is to be done?
How effective are these artificial coral reefs that we use?
Are they? Is their purpose to protect? What is their purpose in terms of what they're supposed to favor?
Promote fish life and
Fish life, yeah, they're mainly for fishing, right? That's actually a controversial issue of whether they actually benefit or whether they just take fish away from other areas. I don't know. That's a good question. But that's actually there's actually a controversy about that, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico. They've abandoned some of the old oil rigs, and the question is, do they leave the oil rigs in place because they're good fish habitat, or do they remove the oil rigs because they're polluting the environment and potentially dangerous and this sort of thing? So yeah, that's what do you think would be the?
I think it's properly stripped down and it doesn't leak anything into the water. I think you should promote some kind of organic.
Well, I'd like to just leave you with how with the 10 things you can do to save the ocean. This is it's adapted from the website of the National Geographic Society. And number one for ocean acidification is what? Well, yes, reduce your carbon footprint, reduce energy consumption. That's going to do a lot to on a global scale, if we could get something going to reduce the amount of carbon that's going into the atmosphere. Something else is to make sustainable seafood choices, and I provided a link there. There's the Monterey Bay Aquarium produces this seafood watch, and I've got a printed one, but you can print it out yourself from the website. For sustainable. Yeah, there's an app for your iPod too on the same website. As a matter of fact, on that page, you can actually choose the app. So if you don't want to take, I suppose that's more modern. You take your iPhone into the restaurant and you see whether it's sustainable. So that tuna sandwich that we had today, is it sustainable, or do you think? Do you think that's a sustainable fishery? the tuna fishery today?
Only certain kinds.
Yeah, that's right. Mostly not, but so that's correct. So anyway, I just wanted to leave you with some things that you can actually do yourself to help the marine environment, and also some web links to some representative non-governmental organizations that are working to protect the oceans, and and becoming involved with them. Actually, I think one of the best things is if you have the opportunity to actually go out into the field and do and work on cleaning up a beach, on helping to restore a coral reef or something like that. To have having that experience yourself is, I think it's a good thing. So again, it's one of those things on the list. And my personal preference is for organizations that actually work in the field to promote marine conservation in particular.
On that note, thank you for your work promoting marine conservation today, bringing this topic to this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank, our sponsors, the New York Times, and also in particular the Office of Global Learning Programs, including Eric Feldman and Stephanie Doscher, and also Hilary Landorf, who's not here today, and you all for coming and sharing your experiences and thoughts on these important topics for life on Earth. So.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
As always, we're reminding everyone that if you haven't registered to vote yet, if you've not had an opportunity to do that, you can find some folks that are registering people to vote in front of the Green Library. I'm not sure if they're there today because there is a Greeks event in front of the library, but basically every day from now until Election Day, or until the deadline for registering to vote, you can find a table out in front of Green Library. So please make sure you register to vote. It's easy and it's fun.